The Jets make two trades and perhaps improve one of the biggest problem areas on defense. Locked On Jets begins now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, August 21st, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Football season is around the corner. Visit the FanDuel app today and start planning your futures bets now. We have a busy show today, plenty of Jets news to break down. Aaron Glenn made a major announcement about the preseason finale. The Jets might be in the market to trade for a wide receiver. But we'll begin by talking about a trade market we know the Jets are part of, the defensive tackle market. The Jets pulled off not one, but two trades yesterday to bring in defensive tackles from other teams. Jowon Briggs was acquired from the Cleveland Browns for a late-round pick swap, and Harrison Phillips was acquired from the Minnesota Vikings for a late-round pick and a late-round pick swap. Now, I'm going to start off by saying that I'm generally speaking not a huge fan of trades at this time of the year. I think the longer you watch the NFL, the more you learn. And I've watched the Jets pull off a lot of August trades in recent years, and a lot of them have not panned out. So I think you have to approach trades at this time of year with caution because, first of all, it can be really tough to bring a guy in at the end of training camp and integrate him into your team. You know, new locker room, new playbook he's got to learn, new coaches. It can be a real challenge. And I remember a few years back after Carl Lawson got hurt, the Jets traded for Shaq Lawson. I thought it was going to be a great move. It just did not pan out for the Jets at all. You also have to be careful because the reason a guy gets traded this time of year is that his original team has no use for him. And if this guy's been on your team through training camp and you're ready to trade him, it can be a red flag. That said, we know that the Jets' defensive tackle spot was incomplete. And what I will say is one of these two trades makes more sense to me than the other. The trade that makes sense is getting Harrison Phillips from the Minnesota Vikings, because this is a guy who has been a quality player through much of his NFL career. He's kind of struggled the last year or two, but only 29. The Vikings are also picking up half of his salary. His salary for the 2025 season, $7.4 million. The Vikings are picking up $3.7 million of that. Now, again, that might be a red flag. The fact the Vikings are willing to pay Harrison Phillips $3.7 million to pay for the Jets. But I think if you look at where the Jets are at the defensive tackle position, and the fact you only give up a late round pick and a late round pick swap, this is a deal that's probably worth making. This is a roll of the dice that I think makes sense for the Jets because defensive tackle spot is not great right now. You have some veteran guys that they brought in the offseason. I mean, even at the time they brought these guys in, I was not a huge fan of what they were doing. Byron Coward coming in, Derek Nandi coming in, even a guy, Jay Tufele, who had a good preseason game against Green Bay, not a guy who's had like a big time career right now. Harrison Phillips is a guy who, at his best, is a good run defender at the defensive tackle spot. And I think we know that the Jets last year really struggled at defensive tackle against the run. Javon Kinlaw was a disaster. Solomon Thomas was a disaster. Leki Fatu did not do the job. And the Jets, I think, are also looking for somebody who can kind of take some of the pressure off Quinnen Williams. Quinnen Williams is the guy who sees nonstop double teams at the defensive tackle spot. At least that's the way it was under Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich. Phillips is the kind of guy who can absorb double teams. He's the kind of guy that can force that second block to get on him. And that could free up Quinnen Williams for more one-on-one assignments. I think there's little doubt that Harrison Phillips is going to be the starting defensive tackle next to Quinnen Williams. He's got the track record. He's been in the NFL about 7 years. He spent some time with Buffalo. He spent some time with Minnesota. Again, he's a guy who hasn't been great the last year or two, but there's a reasonable chance he can bounce back. If the Jets the Jets coach him up, if the Jets, do all the things that they should be doing around him. This is a guy who has been a quality starter in this league before. I'm of the mindset that a late round pick is always worth it if you can get a quality starter in return in a trade. And the price, the $3.7 million price tag is not bad. If the Jets were absorbing the full salary, I might be scratching my head at this deal a little bit. But I think that this is a chance to upgrade a position that, frankly, was a problem spot. Because after Quinnen Williams, I'm not convinced the Jets really had a quality NFL defensive tackle in here. And while there are question marks about how much Phillips can still produce at this point, because, again, he has been down, and Minnesota is trading him and picking up half his salary. I mean, these are warning signs if we're being honest. I think that this is a swing of the bat that probably makes sense for the Jets. The deal that I understood less was Jowon Briggs, who was a 7th-round pick a year ago out of Cincinnati by the Cleveland Browns. Again, the Jets got him and a 7th-round pick in exchange for a 6th-round pick. So the price isn't super high, but this is a guy, he was a 7th-round pick a year ago. He only played 133 snaps. He spent part of the season on the practice squad. One of the reasons I scratch my head a little bit at this is a guy like Briggs probably was going to be cut. And I'm not just convinced that any other team was going to trade for him because he doesn't really have a big time pedigree. There's really nothing about him that would suggest he'd be a hot commodity. And the Jets also have a really high waiver claim. So odds are the Jets probably could have just gotten this guy if they waited for him to be cut. And that's not true of Harrison Phillips. If Harrison Phillips gets cut, he becomes a free agent. And a guy with his track record in a league where teams need these proven defensive tackles, there's a good chance Harrison Phillips would have been traded for. Briggs, I get less because I don't see what made him such a hot commodity that the Jets would want to make a deal for him. The only way that this deal ends up making sense is if Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji are super, super talented at scouting the defensive tackle spot. Now, I think one thing this tells you is that either Denver or Detroit, perhaps both, had a really high draft grade on, or had a decent draft grade on Briggs a year ago when he came out. And maybe he was a priority UDFA for Denver when Muji was there, or Detroit when Glenn was there. This is another guy who projects as kind of a run-stopping defensive tackle. Look, if the Jets traded a draft pick for him, he's going to be on the roster. And this probably spells the end for Derek Nandi, who the Jets signed this offseason from Kansas City. It's clear, based on the reports out of training camp, the Jets do not like what they've seen from Nandi. He's a guy who's pretty much played himself off the roster by the way he performed in Kansas City. So Jets bring in another kind of run-stopping defensive tackle. And, this is it's a clear sign that Aaron Glenn did not think that the Jets had enough to stop the run, because they in one day they bring in 2 run-stopping defensive tackles from other teams. Now, again, Briggs is going to be probably the backup to Phillips. So the Jets probably got their number 1 and number 2 nose tackles, their number 1, number 2 run-stopping defensive tackles in trades yesterday. So Jets clearly focused on upgrading the roster. And that's, if you're looking for one general positive takeaway from all of this, is that the Jets at least are going to try and make moves to upgrade their roster. The Jets are not going to sit around. The Jets are constantly evaluating their roster, and they're not going to sit around. And if they feel there's an upgrade to be made, they will make it. Here on the Locked On Jets podcast, there are some rumblings that could be true at the wide receiver position. We know the Jets wide receiver group not particularly deep right now behind Garrett Wilson. There are rumors that the Jets could be in the mix to make a trade at the wide receiver, but despite the fact they need a receiver, I'm advising caution, and I'll explain why as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. August 26th is officially FanDuel Futures Day, a brand new holiday for football fans who live for bold predictions and preseason hunches. For just 24 hours, FanDuel is giving you deals on NFL season predictions. So whether you're calling your MVP, eyeing a long-shot division winner, or ready to crown your Super Bowl champ before Week 1 even kicks off, this is your moment. So take a flyer on the MVP race. Crown your champion in August, or parlay your division winner dark horses. And there's so much else to do on FanDuel. Of course, baseball's happening right now. Yankees and Mets doing their best out there, I guess, at the moment. Or you can always take a look ahead to other parts of the NFL season. Jets not getting a lot of love from the odds makers. You think the Jets are going to have a better season than the odds makers? Head on over to FanDuel to get in on the action. Visit the FanDuel app today and start planning your future bets now, because Futures Day is one day and one day only. FanDuel, play your game. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. The Jets made 2 trades yesterday for defensive tackles, and they may turn their attention to wide receiver, according to NFL insider Diana Russini of The Athletic. She tweeted out yesterday, the Jets are among several teams monitoring the trade market for potential wide receiver additions per sources. The 49ers and Vikings are also making calls. Now, the phrasing of that to me seemed very odd and very vague. The Jets are monitoring the trade market for wide receiver additions. What would the alternative be? I mean, I would hope the Jets are monitoring the trade market, not just at wide receiver, but everywhere. You don't really know whether a good trade could fall into your lap, at any time. You should always be monitoring the trade market to see if there are good additions, not just at wide receiver, but pretty much anywhere across the board. What would the alternative to monitoring the trade market be? If some team calls an assistant GM with a trade offer at wide receiver and the assistant GM goes into Darren Muji's office, does Muji send him away? If Muji's on the phone with a GM and the GM offers a wide receiver trade, does Muji just hang up? I mean, do the Jets have a bunker they go into if they're not monitoring the wide receiver trade market and some team offers a wide receiver trade? The report doesn't really give us a lot of information about that, other than the Jets are keeping an eye on the wide receiver trade market, which I would assume all teams are doing at all times. But I guess we'll assume that the Jets are interested in pursuing a wide receiver trade at this point. I'm going to give you a controversial take right now. The Jets should be very careful at what they do at the wide receiver position. And I'm not saying that because I'm happy with what the Jets have at wide receiver at the moment, because it's just not very good behind Garrett Wilson. But I do think at this time of year, there's a danger in making a move just for the sake of making a move so that you can say, we've upgraded our wide receiver room. I'm a skeptic that there's going to be an upgrade available at the wide receiver position for the Jets, even given the current state of that position. And it's not good. Right now, after Garrett Wilson, I mean, who's your number 2 guy? Probably Josh Reynolds, who's at best in his career been number 3 guy, and frequently not even been that. But wide receiver is one of those positions where good players typically don't get traded. Good players typically stay on their current team. There's really no team that has enough wide receiver depth that's capable of trading away a quality player. Because you can suffer an injury or two, even if you have a good backup, you're an injury or two away from hurting at a bad position if you trade away your quality depth. I think anybody who could get traded may not be an upgrade over what the Jets have right now. And it's different from trading for a defensive tackle. Teams are willing to give up DTs. The other aspect of this is, while there is an adjustment at defensive tackle, it's an easier adjustment than wide receiver. Because a defensive tackle, at the end of the day, your job is ultimately to beat blocks. At wide receiver, you have to develop chemistry with a quarterback. You have to learn a new playbook. You have to learn how a coordinator wants you to run routes. There are lots of elements. It's difficult to bring in a wide receiver at the end of August and get him fully up to speed for the season. Who's available right now? I mean, is it really worth trading for Kendrick Bourne from New England? Is it really worth trading for Romeo Doubs from Green Bay? I mean, I really am not convinced either of these guys would move the needle for the Jets on the offensive side of the ball. It's almost, and part of me wonders, did the Jets leak that we're monitoring the trade market because they just want the fans to think that they're keeping an eye open for upgrades? That to me makes as much sense as anything. I mean, the only guys I can think of who might be upgrades would be, Jowon Jennings from San Francisco. But there are a couple problems with that. Number one, the 49ers were one of the teams mentioned in the Diana Russini tweet as seeking an upgraded wide receiver. So I don't know if the 49ers if the 49ers are looking to upgrade their wide receiver room, I'm not sure they're going to want to trade away one of their own guys. Jennings on paper would actually be a pretty good fit because, he fits kind of like the mold Aaron Glenn, Darren Muji, Tanner Angstrand are looking for at the wide receiver position right now. He's a guy who's pretty big and a pretty good blocker. And we know the Jets at the wide receiver position, catching the ball, running routes is always the most important thing, your contributions in the passing game. But in an ideal world, they also want a guy who's a good blocker. Jauan Jennings could be that. But I'm skeptical that the Jets would make a deal for him because I don't think the 49ers want to trade him away. The other aspect of this is Jennings has been seeking a new contract. And contract talks have kind of stalled with San Francisco. So you're not just trading for a guy, you're not just sending away a pick. And even if it's a late round pick, it still has some value. You're also going to have to open the contract negotiations and give him a fairly lucrative contract. And I don't know that you want to do that right now. The guy who makes sense to me, I do think there's one guy who could make sense for the Jets if he's available. There have been a few rumors around this guy, and that's Alec Pierce of the Indianapolis Colts. Pierce was a recent second-round pick, a very interesting athletic profile, and a guy who has consistently gotten better and more productive the longer he's been in the NFL. He's a guy who there's some rumors he may be the odd man out in Indianapolis. And he had a pretty good season last year. And having a pretty good season as a Colts receiver a year ago is no small feat because the Colts quarterback situation was a mess in 2024. If you're just an NFL fan, you probably followed it. You probably know the struggles of Anthony Richardson and everything else the Colts had at that position. I do think Alec Pierce is a guy who actually could conceivably be an upgrade for the Jets in the receiver room. But I really think this is a buyer beware situation. And I think that there's a big push, and it's understandable why there's a big push because the receiver room right now for the Jets is not good enough. After Garrett Wilson, you have nothing. I'm not sure that there's another starting caliber receiver on this roster now other than Garrett Wilson. But this is the type of situation where you could end up making a move that you regret because the move you make has to be for a guy who's actually an upgrade, not just a name. We don't want to get Alan Lazard to replace Corey Davis because remember when the Jets signed Lazard and people were just so tired of Corey Davis that they assumed Lazard was an upgrade. They pretty much assumed anybody who wasn't Corey Davis was an upgrade. That's kind of the danger I see right now for the New York Jets at the wide receiver position. You don't want to just make a move for the sake of making a move because what you'll end up doing is sending out an asset and not really improving the position at all. I think that while I would love to see the Jets upgrade the wide receiver position, and while it's in need of an upgrade, the time you make these upgrades is in the spring. The time you make these upgrades is in free agency and in the NFL draft. It's really tough to make your wide receiver position better right now. And the Jets, I think, need to acknowledge that. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to an acknowledgement Aaron Glenn made the other day that the starters will not play the final preseason game for the Jets. Is it a mistake? I think that's a little much to say. I do have a few questions, though, and we'll get into those as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Monarch Money. Most people cannot name their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's why there is Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or your phone. Monarch does the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. You can link all your accounts to Monarch and immediately spot a few subscriptions you're not using. I'm terrible at that. I sign up to all these subscriptions. I forget about them. Use Monarch to fix that and so much more. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDONNFL. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. Tomorrow, the Jets close out their preseason against the Philadelphia Eagles. It's the annual backup bowl. For years and years, going back decades, the Jets have played the Philadelphia Eagles traditionally in the preseason finale, and the starters have very rarely played in this game. And Aaron Glenn made an announcement earlier this week that some of the starters will not play. So it sounds like some of the starters may be in the lineup for this game, but we're not going to see the entire first team offense or the entire first team defense. So that leads to the question, is this a mistake? I think it would be too harsh to call something like this a mistake. This is not something that's going to end up making a huge difference either way. But if you're asking me, I would like to see the starters get some time in this game. Things did not go that well against the Giants. The first team defense gave up a long touchdown. First team offense did get a field goal, but if you watch that game, you saw that there were some clear things the starters need to work out. And the way I view these games is like an opportunity to practice at game speed. In this day and age, the practices NFL teams have do not have a ton of intensity. They cannot replicate game scenarios. That was not true in the past. In the past, NFL teams were able to hit at practice. The players negotiated that out of practices. It's one of the things that when the players in the league negotiate the collective bargaining agreement, which sets the rules of the league, the players, and this goes back to like 2011, one of the deals that they got was the practices could not be as intense anymore. And it's players' rights. But it made it tougher to prepare teams for the season. The practices, especially at training camp, are less intense, which means that I think these exhibition games are the only real opportunity to get your team reps with game intensity. And there were some clear things that the Jets needed to smooth out on offense and defense after that preseason game against the Giants. So your last real chance to get reps at game speed before you take on the Pittsburgh Steelers in week one. Now, do I think that this is going to doom the Jets heading into the 2025 season? No, I do not. Do I think it's a big difference? No, I do not. And there are also reasons for Glenn to not really want to play the starters. Number one is obviously injuries. You don't want to, if the Jets played their starters and some important player got injured, we would never hear the end of how foolish Glenn is. And a lot of people who criticize him for not playing the starters in this game would be all over him. That's the way it works. When I've seen this a million times where people say, and I would not do it. I try and be consistent as best I can on this show, but there are people out there who are probably screaming that Glenn should play the starters. But if Glenn played the starters and somebody important got hurt, that you'd never hear the end of how dumb he was to play the starters. So that's number one. I think the Jets are just looking to avoid injuries. Number two, there are some roster spots that need to be figured out. The Jets are approaching cutdown day, and this game traditionally has been the backup bowl in part because the Jets and Eagles have wanted to avoid getting their key players hurt, but they also use it as a last chance to evaluate the bubble spots. They use it as a last chance to evaluate who's our 53rd guy, who's our 54th guy. Those guys at the back of the roster have one last chance to contribute. And it's also important, I think, for special teams position battles and special teams roster battles. One of the things I think that doesn't get appreciated is on special teams, you can't really evaluate guys in practice. They kind of go half speed. And this goes back to one of the things I was saying earlier. I think special teams, you ever watched one of these training camp practices? You ever go out to the facility at Florham Park and watch special teams practices? They're going at half speed on these returns. They can't really cover the returns. And that's because it's dangerous. The return games, both, I think they try the new rules, they're trying to improve the safety on kickoff returns, but it's not safe to do that at game speed. It's certainly not safe to do it in practice. So you don't really get a chance to evaluate return guys. You don't really get an opportunity to evaluate coverage guys on special teams. And I think that the last few roster spots are going to be determined in no small part by how these guys perform on special teams. So all this is to say that the Jets have some things they're going to need to evaluate. We know who the starters are going to be for the most part. I actually don't think the Jets have a ton of position battles for the starting roles, and I actually don't know how well you'd be able to evaluate the starters because I don't think the Eagles are going to play their starters that deep into the game. So I think if you're looking for individual performance, if you're looking for who's going to be the number 2 receiver, I don't know how you would evaluate that against the quality of the competition for the Eagles. I think the value for the Jets, if they played their first team, would be in just being able to get some reps, get some reps and try and build some chemistry and sort out some of the issues that popped up against the Giants. I don't think there's really as much value in putting your starters out there against second and third teamers to try and evaluate who's good and who's bad. I think there's value in putting the collective unit out there and watching them perform. But the thing when it comes down to is Glenn has a lot of different competing variables at play here when he makes the decision whether the starters play or whether the starters sit. And what it sounds like from what Glenn said, and Glenn not really tipping his hand, he's kind of treated this stuff like a secret the last couple of weeks. Last week when he was asked if the starters were going to play, he said the plan is the plan. So he's not giving us he didn't really give us a ton of information, but it sounds like Jets are not going to play their starters all that much. Would I handle it a little differently if I was the Jets head coach? Yes. Is it a big deal? No. Is it something anybody's going to remember by Saturday? Again, no. It's not really worth getting riled up about. It's not really worth getting upset about. It's just a minor decision in the grand scheme of things, and we'll finally be done with the preseason when Saturday comes. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.